Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 30th installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica, a big history. I'm here with the good Dr. David Pareca, who is a mentor of mine, and we're here together to talk about magic today. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself there, good doctor?
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here chatting with you about all of this. I guess in terms of who I am and my background, I did my PhD at the Warburg Institute at the University of London, which is pretty much ground zero for the study of the academic study of esoterica, so it's an entirely appropriate place to be studying the history of Hermes Trismegistus, and my PhD thesis was on the influence of the texts attributed to Hermes in Latin on the theological and philosophical writings from 1160 to 1300. My original intent had been to cover the period after St. Augustine and before Marsilio Ficino, but that proved to be too large a task for a mere PhD dissertation, and so I had to cut it short, and the biggest challenge was trying to justify which time bracket to choose, and that's where I got prodded the most at my defense, I recall. So that's where I first got myself really steeped in the Hermetic tradition and had to study it very thoroughly. And I've since then developed an interest in the Thermodynamics of Civilization as well, which is the study of energy flows through society that enable civilizations to generate complexity, to generate specialization. The fact that we're sitting here doing what we're doing is the side effect of someone somewhere growing more food than they need to eat. And that surplus is what enables all of the rest of us to do whatever it is that we're doing. And modern society has developed several million different specialized jobs of one sort or another. Our predecessors in previous generations, prior to the application of fossil fuels, had less of a surplus to work with, but nevertheless Thomas Aquinas was a fine scholar, as was Cicero back in his day, and neither of those had to toil too many fields, I'm pretty sure. So the Thermodynamics of Civilization involves the analysis of how those sorts of surpluses get generated, how they get applied, and when they are no longer possible, how do societies react to those circumstances? So it's an ebb and flow kind of phenomenon where centralization happens as surplus is available, and once the surplus no longer is available, centrifugal forces take over, the center no longer holds, and you end up with a relocalized, decentralized society.
Yeah,
so
this is what we on the show call core periphery dynamics.
Well, there you go.
As
that's a good word.
First outlined by Ibn Khaldun in, I think, the 15th century, the 14th century,
something like that,
something around that. So, do you see a link at all, or do you have any perceived links between the study of Hermeticism and the study of the thermodynamics of civilization?
The links aren't, to be perfectly honest, the links aren't obvious to me. I feel that the Hermetic tradition is a component of our cultural past, whereas the thermodynamics of civilization is part of the physical reality of all civilizations.
Right.
So the two overlap only in that, I don't think they overlap that much, to be perfectly honest.
You gotta think harder.
Think harder.
They definitely overlap. I mean, the perception of the world as energy came about as a result of scientific undertakings, which were largely an outgrowth of the Hermetic tradition.
I suppose, but it's a very indirect link. I agree. Okay, so I mean, and it's very much in broad terms. You can't say, I wouldn't say that it's causal.
Right. But I mean, you're the one,
Not
for
directly
example,
causal.
who says that Isaac Newton is
He's
as
crucial.
much a theologian and as much an alchemist as he is a mathematician.
Definitely. He's more of a theologian than he is anything else. The plurality, if not the majority, of his surviving writings are devoted to theology, and another very significant fraction is devoted to alchemy as well. At his death, after several of his personal sales of his library, his estate sale still contained 10% alchemical volumes out of a huge personal library. So Isaac Newton is definitely one of these crucial figures who's actually at the pivot between the Hermetic tradition and the scientific tradition that leads us to discuss thermodynamics in the terms that we do use today.
Right.
And I guess they're thinking harder. Okay, you got me there. You led me there, I should say. In that he very much applied his rigorous methods of developing theory and of devising experiments to test the theory. So as I was saying, Isaac Newton developed theories and devised some very rigorous series of experiments to test those theories, and he applied them to various types of matter in the physical world. So he goes from the subtlest form of matter, which is light, and he devises experiments to test the different properties of light, and even goes so far as to develop and perfect the reflecting telescope in the process of doing this, which then enables him to create other experiments to test his theories of motion, where he's applying the hidden forces, the hermetically inspired idea of hidden forces applied to the physical world, to link the properties of falling objects to the motions of the planets.
Right.
And when he tried to do the same thing to the properties of physical matter in terms of its interactions, material interactions, chemical interactions, he was working from a millennia-old tradition of alchemy, of studying the different interactions between physical elements, except that there was no how-to manual. There was no introduction to alchemy. The whole tradition was purposefully written in a hermetic, in a hidden or a purposefully occult style, originally so as to preserve the recipes. Literally, it's a sort of a trade secret kind of thing for the Egyptian metal workers who were making fake gold for the foreign tourists going to Egypt and wanting to have the fancy jewelry like the upper classes, but not being able to afford it. And so those formulas for making fake bling bling, so to speak, once the demand for that stuff, on account of the processes involved in the thermodynamics of civilization, once the demand for that fake bling bling erodes away in late antiquity, the need for these guilds of metal workers go away, and their tradition goes away with them. And later on, we get other people who find these texts unaware of what their original purpose was, reading them through a mystical lens. And that's how you get the two different branches of Western alchemy, one of them working on making metals, perfecting metals, and the other on perfecting the soul, and leading to the Philosopher's Stone.
And that was largely elaborated in the Victorian era of occultism as well.
They certainly
it's largely a fabrication of the 19th century, this alchemical perfection of the soul and the transubstantiation of...
they certainly picked it up and ran with it in that direction, but I think it was there.
It was there, but
certainly the imagery is suggestive in many instances.
Yeah.
The Aurora Consurgens text attributed to Thomas Aquinas is a wonderfully illustrated manuscript that touches on every single. I mean, what we know of alchemical symbolism is usually people who study that stuff start with that text.
Yeah.
So, and the imagery from that manuscript. Anyway.
Yeah. There's also a conflation which happened when England was involved in India. Well, the British Empire was involved in India, where Indian alchemy has a large component, this yogic component of working on the self through various and Chinese alchemy as well, through various elixirs and monatomic gold and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
That tradition got kind of syncretized in the 19th century with European alchemy, and then that got projected back into history. But yeah, that isn't to say that there wasn't this. I mean, definitely someone like John of Rupescissa was a friar or a Franciscan monk who used alchemy for spiritual purposes as well as for physical purposes. But in any case, we should let's move backwards.
I was about to just finish on Newton, just to say that his alchemical experiments were a miserable failure. He even practically went mad as a result, and it's not clear if it's because of the failure or because of his exposure to chemicals in the process of 3 or 4 months of intense experimentation. But he never wrote an original word in his life afterward. He only re-edited his previous works and went off to work for the Royal Mint. And as a result of those failed experiments, alchemy is relegated to the Department of History in terms of its study, and chemistry went on into the Faculty of Science. So there's that. Yes, going backward, as you were saying.
All right, well, let's, because in our chronology, we're sort of just hopping into the Hellenistic age. Maybe let's talk about magic more broadly. Everybody has a working definition of magic. Especially magic means different things to different people at different times. In relevance to history, in the historical study of magic, what does magic mean to you? When you say you are a scholar of magic, what is this magic you're talking about?
It's a set of practices that tends to involve the manipulation of physical objects and the utterance of words that may or may not make sense for defined purposes, often involving the invocation of supernatural powers. That probably encompasses the vast majority of what can be called magic. Problem being, as you suggested in introducing the topic, is that one person's religion is another person's magic and vice versa. And so inevitably magic is something by which mainstream or legitimate figures of authority define themselves against, whether that be ancient priesthoods or the Christian churches. The authority that they claim is defined in opposition to things that are magical, just as the modern scientist would define himself largely in opposition to things magical.
Right.
In terms of the history of magic, I would suggest that magic lies in the space between, or falls in the space between, religion, philosophy, and science, in the sense that it shares with religion appeals to divine powers, and also shares very often the very same prayers that are used in legitimate religious rituals. It shares with science a tendency toward empirical experimentation. There's a very good reason why Lynn Thorndike, the American historian of science, his main work is entitled A History of Magic and Experimental Science, and it spans 8 volumes and is pretty much ground zero when it comes to studying the history of magic in the English language. So in magical operations, or in magical grimoires, collections of recipes, we see these very, very elaborate rituals, that involve the manipulation of a large assortment of more or less obscure ingredients and so on. Prayers that might be said in spoken in a language that the operator understands and sometimes not. And there are often several variant versions of very similar spells aiming for the same ends that suggest that some operators tweaked certain components of the spells, and that these spells or rituals were repeated in many iterations, and by the law of averages, at some point, one of them will work. It'll just happen to work in that particular time, and that is why so the operator, in the instance where it did work, will take very great care in taking down the exact details of what they did.
All the hits and none of the misses.
Exactly. So we get this confirmation bias that manifests in these large collections of very elaborate and strange-seeming recipes. And in the magical grimoire entitled the Picatrix, the Goal of the Wise, in the original Arabic, the Hayat al-Hakim, in one of the sections, the hypothesis to experiment cycle that is very familiar to modern science is described in pretty much so many words. So that's how one of the examples of how magic and science overlap. They overlap through the phenomenon of experimentation. Magic also overlaps with philosophy in the form of having shared theories in terms of the cosmologies as well as the theories of the soul that arise in Neoplatonism in particular. I would suggest that most of medieval magic is based on an Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology with a Platonic or Neoplatonic theory of the soul.
Yes.
To get back to the main point, magic overlaps with philosophy in shared theories, and I can describe some of these shared theories a little more if you like, wherein the hierarchy of being is really important to Neoplatonism in terms of putting all of existence in rational order of some sort, with the one, or God, or the divine at the very top, at the apex of this pyramid sort of thing. And downward from there, or maybe I should start at the bottom. It makes sense in either direction you approach it.
And there are numerous orders. I mean, the Picatrix gives 4 different orders.
It does. But normally you have inert matter at the bottom, which, because it doesn't move, doesn't have a soul. So it's at the bottom and is described as being made of the 4 elements and so on. Corruptible, impermanent, subject to change, etc. All of these things that God isn't.
Right.
And that's why the contrast between the material world and God is absolutely maximal in the system, and it's partly why also this system was quite appealing to Christian theologians trying to have a framework for their system of thought. So above inert matter you have plants that have... So this is a hierarchy based on categories of soul. So you have soulless stuff at the bottom, you have God, the ultimate soul, at the top.
Yeah.
And above inert matter you have plants that grow, and because they grow, they move. And having a soul means being animate, having the capacity for movement. And plants have movement by virtue of growth. They take up increasingly more space. And so they have what is known as a vegetable or a vegetative soul. Above plants are animals. Not only do they have a vegetable soul, but they are capable of autonomous movement. And so they are animate, and so animals have an anima, they have a soul. Humans share all the characteristics of the levels below them, in the sense that we are made of inert matter, we grow in space, and we can move about. But what distinguishes us from animals is the fact that we have also, in addition to all of the below, we have a rational soul, which allows us the capacity for contemplation, the capacity to distinguish good and evil. And the rational soul is precisely what we share with the one layer above us, which are the immaterial rational souls. We have materials, angels, demons, exactly, which end up being conflated with the planets, and that is how the Neoplatonic hierarchy of being overlaps with astrology, and where the two can be made compatible in an internally coherent system of magic. And of course, above the angels and demons and such is God, who is the unchangeable, perfect, all of the different characteristics that we would describe as God belong there at the apex of the pyramid. And the link with magic is that the occult links, vertical links in this hierarchy of being, are precisely represent the knowledge that the magician has, and he can pull on these strings to manipulate the different layers in this hierarchy of being. So, and these vertical hidden links are links that proceed by analogical thinking.
Right. The magician is the one who knows that everything was once one thing, and because everything was once connected, he knows what the connections are.
Yeah.
Now that the one has become the many, he knows what the process of disintegration was, and so he can play with those resonances and those sympathies to manipulate nature.
Yep.
Or the spirits.
I like the analogy of resonances, because the harmony of the spheres is a thing, and so on. I've always thought of them myself as sort of the hierarchy of being as being a tidily layered thing that has hidden strings that go up and down.
Yes.
And I guess by the analogy of resonance fits very nicely, because if those strings are nicely taut, one can play them like a harp. And that's kind of what the magician does, in that he or she would know which minerals connect in a hidden way to which plants, which connect in what ways to hidden ways to animals, and into which different types of human personality, and upward in the hierarchy to with the appropriate angels or demons to assist as spirits in the operation, and so on. A little tidbit that's relevant to your podcast here is the special place of crystals in this system, whereby they are the one form of inert matter that appears to have the property of growth. And that is the reason why crystals are considered so important. Crystals, gems, and so on are considered so important in magical operations, is because they have a limited form of mineral soul that distinguishes them clearly from the rest of random rocks.
Minerals with a vegetable soul.
Sort of, yeah, but it's a limited form of mineral soul, and it seems to they live sort of in a little corner on their own, because it's not like plants have a mineral soul in the same way that crystals do. It's like an alternate form of growth.
Right.
And, pushing that analogy to a hypothetical extreme, one could, if one were to take the crystal component of the material world and project similar things upward through an analogous hierarchy of being, one ends up with crystalline plants, crystalline animals, and so on.
Yes. It's like a divergence in a tree.
You got it.
That's funny. Okay. Well, because of where we're at in our chronology, this is all rather kind of late. This is all the sum of all the things that we've been discussing. So let's bring it back.
Sure.
What would you say the earliest instances of magic were? What's our kind of earliest evidence, or what do we, anthropologists and so forth, think is the first usage of magic?
I would have to throw that question back at you, in the sense that to ask, how could one ever distinguish from this distance between religion and magic that far back?
Right, or technology and magic.
Technology and magic to some extent, but I mean, let's say mastering fire is very much an operational, not necessarily magical thing. If you're asking about the first magic you're asking about the first.
But you're assuming a non-animistic context, then. You're assuming that there are magical and non-magical things when the universe is all magical. Because none of it is magical.
Yeah. Okay.
We have these modern categories now, and so we have to play with them.
I would say the first magic comes about along with the first manifestation of quote-unquote legitimate religion, if we're going to go with the definition I was using earlier.
Okay.
And I would think that the definition I used earlier becomes less and less useful the further away from Western civilization you get.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I would agree with a colleague, Marco Pazzi, who in the Societas Magica newsletter published 10 Theses de Magia, where some of which involve defining magic as precisely a Western concept and trying to apply it to other times and other places is inappropriate because it does violence to what goes on in those places and at those times, because it's a concept that Western figures of authority primarily have used to define themselves against, as I was mentioning earlier.
Right.
And so in the absence of those authorities, our concept of magic doesn't have much meaning.
Very true.
Whether those figures of authority be religious or scientific in our case.
Yeah.
In the more modern
And I mean, this is a very this is a historian's perspective.
Very much so.
We have, and that's
I can't help it.
Right. I mean, that's what's in vogue, and for good reasons in history nowadays, is that you don't attribute labels to, you don't retro project labels on people.
Yeah.
You try to come and understand cultures with their own language, with their own terms, as opposed to imposing terms. A really good book that discussed this in quite some detail is Carolyn Bynum's Holy Feast and Holy Fast. So a question that she asks is whether it's appropriate to call medieval mystic women anorexic because they refuse to eat.
Well, it reminds me of the search for Marxism in Chaucer. I mean, how much sense does that make?
Yeah, or whether Jesus was a socialist or not. These are anachronisms, and they're best avoided.
I would say so.
So then let's talk about a period of time then when magic perhaps could be spoken of, and that's, I would say, starting around the Bronze Age and onward, with the Babylonians and the Egyptians.
Absolutely.
And there was enough other to start using terms like magic. And let's not forget that magic comes from the Zoroastrian magi, and it's a Greek word.
Yep, to describe the Persian priests.
Right.
And it didn't initially necessarily have negative connotations, aside from the foreignness, which for a fairly xenophobic culture like ancient Greece, that has not positive implications necessarily. I mean, they are not us; they have these magi. But anyway, so. If we're so you're talking about the earliest manifestations of magic, probably it would have to involve the earliest sort of Babylonian or Egyptian encounters with the other's religion, and I would include certainly the ancient Hebrews in that lot as well, in terms of seemingly perpetually being everyone else's other.
I think this would especially take place in terms of material culture as well, because you're far more likely to encounter another religion's product than a person of another religion in, 800 BC.
Yeah, good point. I mean, how did the Greeks react to the divination bowls that they may or may not have been aware of in the ancient Near East? So. Earliest manifestations of magic. So that's what it would have to be, I would imagine. I mean, but what evidence would we have nowadays of that phenomenon?
Well, talismans and curse tablets, and
that's much later again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the curse tablets are not exclusively Roman phenomenon, but they certainly flourish as a phenomenon in Roman times.
Yeah, but that's a Greek practice.
Yeah, it did start as a Greek
and I
practice.
wouldn't be surprised if they. I mean, there's all sorts of inscriptions in tin lamellas and Orphic ritual, and even the Picatrix has a bunch of them, which
Oh, yeah.
are probably
That's-
holdovers from
Yeah, it's much
Greek magic.
Yeah, definitely. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
In my mind.
So, can you tell me a little bit then about the Greek magical papyri?
Oh, right. They first of all never circulated all in one collection, as we now handily have them in Hans-Dieter Betz's The Greek Magic Papyri in Translation.
Which is called the PGM for
Yeah.
most of you guys.
Exactly, and it was originally a collection put together by a German scholar whose work was interrupted by the Second World War, but the volumes carried on being published, and Hans-Dieter Betz did a very handy English translation of the lot with very useful commentary and so on. It was published in 1985, I think the second edition in 92 perhaps. But those texts never circulated all sort of bound together in one collection like we have them today. And so in that sense, when you ask about the Greek magical papyri, you're asking to some extent about
Greek magic.
Yeah,
A careful curation in this man's mind of Greek magic.
Exactly. It's Betz's collection that you might be asking about, because there's much more to Greek magic than what is in there, as important as those sources are.
Yes.
Right. They're the vast bulk of the textual sources to do with Greek magic are that. What they are exceptional and important by virtue of being contemporaneous. These are actually the papyri that practicing magical operators used and wrote back in the day. So that is distinct to some extent from, let's say, some of the medieval manuscripts that of magical grimoires that may or may not have been the result of practice. May have been the result more of scribal practice.
Yeah, of armchair accumulation. Exactly,
than actual practitioners. But the Greek magical papyri are the real deal. And the archaeologists have even found figurines that correspond exactly to what is described in some of the rituals in the Greek magical papyri. So we know that people actually did this. And I'm talking specifically of a voodoo-type doll with spikes driven through it in several different orientations and so on. And I think it's one of the sort of harsher love magic spells that certainly to a modern audience come across as very coercive and unsettling. But seem to have been in fairly high demand in antiquity, considering that there's a significantly large proportion of these spells are precisely of that sort. Magic seemingly was the resort of people desiring something badly enough, but being powerless enough in their day-to-day life to achieve it, that they have to resort to magic, to illegal means, i.e. to magic, in order to achieve it. Yeah. And that applies as much to the Greek magical papyri as it would to the recipes contained in the Picatrix or any of the other grimoires that were actually used for practical purposes.
Right, and this would probably only be exacerbated by the rise of individualism, which is, a rather late phenomenon.
Well, as far as your chronology is concerned, yeah.
Yeah, we're getting there. Cosmopolitanism and syncretism are at the root of it.
Yeah.
So
the Greek magical papyri are largely outside of the time frame that you have reached in your chronology so far. I mean, the earliest ones are maybe early 2nd century BC.
Yeah.
The vast majority are 3rd, 4th, 5th century AD.
Could they be said to reflect an older tradition?
Probably.
Yeah, probably is the word.
Yeah.
And now the reason for this is because any form of papyri would be obliterated from this.
Oh, papyrus is a very resilient material in the right climate. That's why all of these have come from Egypt.
Yeah.
And very few from elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a great irony in Egypt that all the bodies stuck in the desert sand are well preserved, and the ones stuffed in tombs and embalmed and are rotten.
Well, I mean, what's left in the sands is actually just bones. And there's certain places where you cannot walk without crunching human bone underfoot. Because you can't bury anything anywhere.
Yeah.
But you can dig a hole in the sand, and 2 weeks later, the sands have shifted and everything's been blown around, and then the dogs turn up, and all that's left is bone, and sun bleached in not too long. So, just as in other places, it's ostraka, broken pottery, where the same thing happens. So, and the Greek magical papyri are a great example of the syncretism you were mentioning earlier, because they do manifest very, very visibly the phenomenon of appropriating the other and attributing to the other culture, magical prowess that one's own culture does not possess.
Right.
And there are plenty of examples of cross-cultural syncretism in the Greek magical papyri, where Hebrew angels are cited, as well as Egyptian deities and some Syriac and Babylonian deities and so on. All of them thrown together in a sort of shotgun-style mishmash in hope of in the magician's hope of gaining the favor of one or the other or of some subset of those divine powers to achieve their ends. And to me, studying the purposes for which magic is practiced is particularly interesting, precisely for the reason I was mentioning.
Yeah, how can magic be used to build social histories?
That's that. So by studying the different proportions of the purposes of magic in a given collection, let's say the Picatrix, but one could apply it with the proviso I mentioned earlier about the Greek magical papyri. One could take that as a sample collection and apply this and see in general, why are people practicing magic? And so how important is love magic versus social influence magic on one's social superiors versus finding lost objects versus
destroying cities
versus anything else you might care, generating wealth, generating harvests, protecting travelers. There's all sorts of different reasons people practice magic, and the relative proportions of these different purposes, when you look at a fairly coherent collection, can tell you something about what priorities a society had, what level of general social welfare or living standard they have. I mean, are people concerned about staving off starvation, or are they concerned about protecting trade?
Now that I think about it, it's very honest, because what it basically is saying is, if I have the power to do anything in the world, if there are no obstacles to me between me and my desire, what are the things that I'm going to want to accomplish? And then you look at what the desired outcome of every single grimoire entry is, and you get this very cohesive picture of what is the cumulative desire of this culture.
Yeah, and invariably it revolves around
money, sex, power.
Money, sex, power, and health.
Yeah,
health is a big deal.
Very much so.
And different grimoires and different time periods have different emphases on stones and herbs versus astrology and this kind of thing.
The Picatrix is very strange in this regard, because it sits very tenuously between those two categories, where on one hand you have spells for money, sex, power, and so forth, but then on the other hand you have all these theoretical bits about, you want to be like the Indian sage who sits on his mountain and is pure and fasts for 40 days and
summons the power of will.
Yeah, and calls the angels through the power of God. It's this very, I guess you could call it, right-hand path, if you want to make that dichotomy. Right-hand path, left-hand path, very ambiguous. in a work like the Picatrix.
Yes, which acknowledges itself to be a compilation, let it be said. And, I mean, the compiler claims to have included material from 224 books in his collection, many of which we know and have identified, and it makes it a really interesting text in terms of what was available to a compiler in 10th century Spain.
Right.
And what was noble to someone at that point. So, and the knowledge stretches very far east indeed. And when he speaks of the Indian sages, he's not making it up.
Right.
So,
how did all of this transition into medieval magic? Was there not a gap in European magic? How do we go from Platonism to Renaissance magi?
That's one of the singular mysteries, and it seems as though some elements of ancient magic managed to survive through the folkloric tradition of oral transmission. There's some bits and pieces that go in that direction. In the research I've done, one of the common elements that links the magic found in the Greek magical papyri to the Picatrix, to what Richard Kiekefer has called the Eunuch Handbook, which is this late 15th century Latin grimoire of 81 or so spells from Germany. The one common element between all three is the invocation of certain Hebrew angels.
Yeah.
And they are, it seems as though, the continued presence of Jewish communities at the periphery of the ancient Greco-Roman culture, at the periphery of the medieval Arabic culture, certainly in Spain.
The eternal other.
The eternal other, and in the periphery of Western Latin, Western European culture, combined with the fact that is the one subset of culture that remain rigorously literate throughout.
And generated Christianity.
Of course.
Which acts as a legitimizing...
for Western, is that they all share the Old Testament as a holy text, and so what the comment you just made about Christianity applies just as much to Islam as well, in terms of the relationship with Judaism. So the continued presence of the Jewish culture in Europe is part of what I think helps explain at least that element of continuity in the practice of magic. The fact that these very same angels are the same ones that we can find in 3rd century Egypt to 10th century Spain to 15th century Germany is the indication that there has to be some kind of continuity there.
Yeah. Well, and there is this constant theme of if magic is somebody else's religion, the closest other religion to Western Europe always was Judaism, because of all these pockets of Jewish communities throughout Europe.
Yeah.
They were the eternal other, therefore magic was always manifest as Jewish.
Yeah.
Eventually Muslim, following the Crusades, especially after contact with Sufi mystics and these sorts of people. But it does stand to reason that Western magic is saturated with Hebrew religion because they are the, as we've been calling it, the eternal other.
Yeah. That being said, I don't want to overemphasize the continuity, because it seems very tenuous otherwise. There's no obvious direct textual transmission.
Yeah, it's constantly being reconceptualized, which is different from the Jewish tradition, because that is a true tradition.
That is continuous.
That's Kabbalah is the tradition that is passed down.
Yeah.
And that is very consistent. And so maybe Western magic in large part glints kind of reflections off of this tradition and tries to kind of piggyback onto its legitimacy by choosing the right words and the right symbols and so forth, the right angelic names, and they're trying to, let's say, leech legitimacy.
Yeah. One mustn't underestimate the oral tradition, the combination of oral tradition and desperation, in the sense that, especially for things like harvests and healing, medicine, there's always going to be the wise woman who knows the herbs in the village, and that knowledge is a master to apprentice kind of tradition of transmission.
Yeah, it is,
which is
non-textual.
Non-textual, utterly undocumented. But
it leaves no trace.
It leaves no trace. But the fact that we're still seeing, let's say, magic circles being used in the Eunuch Handbook, as we see them being used in the Greek magic papyri, surely there's something there. That there may be overlap there with the appeal of circles and spheres in cosmology. The fact that this circle or the sphere is the most concise geometrical figure in 2 and 3 dimensions, respectively.
Yeah.
The easiest to define.
Cycles are obvious pattern. I mean, exactly. A pattern is a cycle.
Yep. Yeah.
Cyclicality is the sine qua non of patternness.
So one of my principal interests lies precisely in trying to find evidence of the continuities we're discussing, and one of the next targets of my study is actually going to be magic circles, as well as the locations where magicians are prescribed in these grimoires to perform their rituals.
Could you elaborate on that?
I can elaborate on the magic circles in terms of asking whether they are meant for protecting whatever is inside them from evil influences on the outside, or are they used for the enclosure of evil things on the inside to protect the operator who stands outside, and what patterns are observable in one or the other of these phenomena. Which kinds of spells require circular motions or the drawing of circles of some sort or other, and what purposes are involved, and so on. So that's one component. The other I'm interested in is to find out how much overlap there is between magical practice in terms of where magic is to be practiced, the locations themselves, and the equivalents, let's say, in mainstream religion. So in, let's say, Greco-Roman antiquity, yes, you had temples, but all of this religious ceremonies would happen outdoors, and many religious sanctuaries and places that are considered religiously potent were natural places, groves, mountaintops, caves, and these kinds of things. So I'm interested in seeing what kind of overlap there is between the perception of being religiously potent overlaps with being magically potent. And in later grimoires like the Picatrix, it seems like we see a lot of magic needing to be done in specially dedicated buildings, which indicates a different perspective. But sure enough, we are talking about an Islamic culture where all worship happens indoors, pretty much.
Yeah, there's also a lot of high altitude stuff.
Yes.
Which is probably having to do with being able to see the planets.
Mm-hmm. Climbing trees and going on roofs and so on. Agreed.
Mountaintops, hilltops, that sort of thing.
For antiquity, yes. I don't recall seeing that in the Picatrix much.
I think I saw it in there a couple times.
Okay. Well, maybe we haven't reached those parts yet in our work. There are many wondrous things, of course. In the
Picatrix. Could you tell me a bit about the Asclepius?
Oh, the Asclepius, of course. That's the...
I mean, I know, again, we've kind of been hopping around and not really being chronologically consistent, but that doesn't really matter.
Okay.
So, please tell me about the Asclepius.
Okay, the Asclepius is the one dialogue attributed to Hermes Trismegistus that survived from antiquity into the Middle Ages. There's there are close to 80 Latin manuscripts of it that survive, which makes it not quite a bestseller, but it's way up there. There are many more obscure works than it that circulated in the Middle Ages, let's put it that way. It is part of the corpus of ancient Hermetic works that were originally written in Greek, possibly, probably in Egypt or Northern Africa. Or certainly that's where they seem to have been most popular in antiquity. The Asclepius itself had been extant in a Greek original. So one of the poems toward the end of the dialogue appears as a hymn in a Greek magical papyrus from the 1st century AD. We know that the Latin author Lactantius, who was writing during the reign of Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, is quoting from the Greek text of the Asclepius in his Latin works. And so the Greek text was around by that time for sure. There's no evidence of a Latin text up to that point. The first evidence pretty much we see of the modern Latin version
is 4th century.
Is late 4th, is St. Augustine actually.
Yeah.
In his City of God, where he cites what is obviously the medieval Latin Asclepius in his City of God. He cites several pages of it, quite extensive passages. There are also several extracts from the Asclepius that survive in Coptic from the Nag Hammadi library. The Prayer of Thanksgiving, that is also the same one that appears in Greek, is in Coptic, and there are certain sections, some of the same ones that Augustine cites actually are also available extant in Coptic.
So could you tell me about the content?
The content.
Who are the characters?
Okay, so we have, it's a cast of 4. Hermes, the master and purported author of the dialogue, his principal disciple and interlocutor, after whom the dialogue is named, the Asclepius. And there are 2 other characters, Ammon or Hammon and Tat are the names that they are given in this dialogue. These are characters that are, I would say, stock characters in the Hermetic Dramatis Personae.
Yeah, they're Ammon and Thoth.
And they are also extant in other Hermetic dialogues that only survive in Greek. There are dialogues to Tat that are mentioned, and so on. So the content is quite varied, actually. The Asclepius is the single longest Hermetic treatise or Hermetic dialogue that survives, but it does seem itself to be a compilation. The original format of these Hermetic texts seems to have been that of aphorisms or gnomic statements that then receive various layers of commentary that then get couched in a dialogue literary format at a later stage. And so, and this sort of format sometimes comes across in the Asclepius as well, where you can tell that a certain gnomic statement is mentioned and then there's an extensive discussion of it. And Asclepius, the disciple, would throw in a one-line question or a one-line statement, and Hermes exclaims, well, how mistaken you are, let me tell you about this. That kind of thing. How quickly you forget our lessons, and this sort of thing. But the topics covered are the division of things into individuals, species, and genera. And the writing on those topics is singularly obscure.
Taxonomical writing.
Yeah, I guess that's what it amounts to. He discusses the nature of the soul. He discusses the special and singular position of humans, of man, in the cosmos, because we are the only beings who are capable of transcending their intrinsic nature, i.e. the material nature, in order to rise themselves in the hierarchy of being. And part of the tradition that sees the Hermetic conventicles from antiquity, if you want to look at if you want to see them that way, as initiatory mystery cults. The various layers of initiation represent this process of abandoning one's material considerations in favor of more spiritual, more lofty considerations of our rational soul. The Asclepius also discusses the summoning of spirits into statues so that they may foretell the future. And these are the passages that St. Augustine criticizes with some bile.
Right, because he's not he doesn't disregard it wholesale. He
describes it as idolatrous and perfidious.
Oh, does he?
Oh, absolutely. Very much so. Very much
because
so.
Augustine does have some praise for Hermetic works elsewhere.
Oh, no. It's part of the wretched idolaters.
Is there a church father who does?
Yes. You're thinking perhaps of the pseudo-Augustine, now known as Quodvult Deus, or identified as Quodvult Deus, who wrote a book, Adversus Quinque Hereses, Against the Five Heresies, in which he cites some of Lactantius's passages that are more sympathetic toward the Hermetic perspective.
That is what I'm thinking.
That's what you're thinking of. And the problem is that Quodvult Deus was one of Augustine's successors as Bishop of Carthage, and their works got completed in the Middle Ages, and that's why there was this push-pull relationship with respect to Hermes in general and the Asclepius in particular, because we have, on the one hand, Augustine, City of God, criticizing it vehemently, and we have this other pseudo-Augustine...
Who is Augustine, as far as they know.
Exactly, saying reasonably charitable things about it. Because in one of the passages from the Asclepius, we hear of man being the nexus between God and the world.
Right.
A central figure who is all the more special because
of his centrality.
Because of our centrality, but our capacity to transcend as well. And tip the balance Godward in terms of all of creation in that sense. I'm extrapolating a little bit from the original there. And another important passage of the Asclepius is what I call the Apocalypse of Egypt, where Hermes.
Oh yeah,
it's a very powerful lament.
I think I've read it,
and at some point you may well want to read it right into your podcast
because
it's. Oh, you have. Oh, good.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that because it's just about the most moving defense of ancient paganism that survives from that time, and that's another bit that Augustine cites in toto. In order to mock it.
Yeah, essentially. I could see him very much mocking it.
So, the Asclepius also discusses whether or not there is such a thing as the void. He discusses...
Which is why I've been talking about the materialists so much. Democritus and...
he says that
Heraclitus as well, who...
according to Hermes,
fire and void.
Yep, there's no such thing as a void, according to Hermes. So, he also discusses the trio of fate, necessity, and causation. And there are significant passages talking about that, which is of some philosophical interest. So, broadly speaking, the Asclepius is of great interest to the Renaissance because of its ancient justification of the primacy of humans' position in the universe. And that justifies humanism. It's an ancient confirmation of the righteousness of humanism.
Ah, very nice.
It's one of the reasons they liked Hermes so much.
All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Do you have any last-minute things that you want to say?
Well, there's a few bits of the introduction that I actually never got around to earlier. To mention that there is such an organization as the Societas Magica that is devoted to the scholarly study of magic from a historical perspective. Historical and other perspectives, but the website is societasmagica.org. I'm the vice president of that organization. I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Classical Studies at the University of Waterloo, which is where I hang my career hat when I'm not doing other things like canoeing the lakes of Algonquin Park.
There you go.
So, Dan, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been great chatting with you.
Well, thanks for coming on, and I will surely have you again.
Sounds very good.
All right.
Cheers.